Kia ora, I'm Chelsea Daniels, and this is The Front Page, a daily podcast presented by the New Zealand Herald. Marsden Point operated as New Zealand's only oil refinery for nearly 60 years. At its peak in the 80s, it employed around 1,700 people. When it was closed in 2022, nearly 240 people lost their jobs. Run by Channel Infrastructure, the site now operates as New Zealand's largest fuels import terminal, storing and distributing 40% of the country's fuel. In recent weeks, a slew of ministers have visited the site, with New Zealand First in particular floating the idea of introducing our first special economic zone to help pump investment into the site and life back into the Northland economy. Later, Channel Infrastructure CEO Rob Buchanan takes us through the future of Marsden Point. But first on the front page, Massey University Emeritus Professor of Sustainable Energy and Climate Mitigation, Ralph Sims, joins us to discuss the site's past and potential. First off, Ralph, pretend I've never heard of Marsden Point before. Can you tell me what is it?
Right. Well, Marsden Point is an oil refinery located up in Northland, and it was established in 1964 because we were bringing petrol and diesel into New Zealand already refined. Thought it was cheaper if we brought in crude oil and then produced our own fuel products. And that worked well for quite some time. We were producing maybe half of New Zealand's demands of petrol, diesel and aviation fuel. A refinery takes crude oil, which is a very complex chemical, if you like, and it varies from place to place. So a refinery breaks it down into useful products. And petrol, diesel, the obvious ones, aviation fuel, jet fuel as it's called, also kerosene, other products, chemical use as well. And also bitumen is the stuff left over, which of course we seal our roads with. So that all comes from an oil refinery.
And so it hasn't been used as a refinery, of course, since it closed down in 2022. In the mid-1980s, though, the refinery substantially expanded and upgraded to allow for increased production. Extra tanks, utility supplies and environmental treatment units were added along with a 170-kilometre Marsden Point to Auckland pipeline. Now, it's safe to say, hey, that the 80s were really its boom time.
That's right, because it was expanded. A hydro cracker was installed, which was quite innovative at the time. To get more diesel out of a barrel of oil, you can only get so much petrol, so much diesel, so much for the other products. And the hydro cracker was to say, let's get more diesel out because of our diesel demand, agricultural demands, trucks, etc. So this was a project. It was owned by the New Zealand refining companies. It was Shell, the oil company, that first thought about it, and then they went into partnership with all the other oil companies in New Zealand and set up the business. And so then they thought they'd expand, and then Mr. Muldoon came along with his Think Big project, so he thought that was a good idea, threw money at it, and then it took 5-6 years. 1986 it finally opened because there were strikes and there were delays and there was over budget. And then eventually the government did a secret deal with the oil companies to pay for all the changes that had occurred. And that meant that we were then able to produce about 70% of our total fuel demand. We were still importing some diesel, some, and of course in the 1970s there were the oil shocks around the world, and we were having carless days and rationing diesel, etc., because there just simply wasn't enough that the refinery could produce because of the oil supply, but also buying imported products. And so that was another reason to give it a boost in the 80s. Interestingly, New Zealand by that time was exploring and producing oil and gas, but our oil was what's called a light sweet crude, and it didn't match the refinery processing characteristics. Most of our crude oil that we extracted was sent off to a refinery in Australia. And we were importing this medium sour crude from other parts of the world, Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates and wherever. And so that was unfortunate, really, because we were still relying on imported product, and a small percentage, very small percentage of our own crude oil would be blended in with the imported stuff, but not enough to make us self-sufficient.
The Right Honourable Winston Peters.
That from the person who agreed secretly to close down one of the three big industries in this country, namely Marsden Point. Never told the workers, never told the unions, never told anybody up north. No, covertly did that, and she laughs. This critical componentry, she laughs about it. Then she accuses me of going secretly to the Prime Minister. No, all 20 cabinet ministers were required to write to the Prime Minister with their ideas. That's what I did. So don't believe the media crap and hype that somehow we did something special. And isn't it appalling? The Deputy Prime Minister has been caught talking to the Prime Minister. Only Labor could think there's something wrong with it.
Looking back, do you think that there were any missed opportunities to integrate, I guess, more sustainable practices into Marsden Point's refining activities?
Yes, well, there was a lot of debate and discussion about exactly what production it should achieve. From an economic sustainability point of view, if we'd have gone to 100% refining, and if anything had gone wrong, then that would have been a risk. The economic balance, as I understand it, was that we would produce 2/3 or so of our own fuels, but still have some reliance on imported fuels, which gives some flexibility, reduces the risk. I guess that was the main reason for not going to a full large refinery. But of course, that was one of the reasons why it did close down in 2022, because it's a relatively small refinery on a global basis. And the cost of oil shipping is a long way to come. And the value of the products was such that it was actually thought cheaper to import refined products from Singapore and other Asian countries rather than carry on with refining here. And of course, by that time, it was, or some of it was 40, 50 years old, and these chemical engineering production processes, the equipment doesn't last forever. So there was quite a maintenance operation going on. So in the end, from an economic sustainability point of view, they decided maybe we would shut it down and import refined products. And that's another issue, because it was decided not to mothball the plant, which means to sort of shut it down but put grease on it and paint it and protect it, and so that it could be used again. It was just decommissioned. It was just shut down, and that was it. So parts of it have gone rusty and parts of it have been sold off, and there's more other bits that are possibly going to be sold, from what I understand. The government, I think Minister Shane Jones has been thinking of recommissioning the refinery, but it would be very difficult and very expensive to do. So there has been a report to assess whether that's feasible or not. The idea being that in this day and age, with all the geopolitical unrest and such like, we would have more security if we produced more of our own fuels. But that's unlikely to happen, I think. I think the cost, it would be billions of dollars to renovate it.
In terms of the chat about making the area or Marsden Point a special economic zone, how does that sit with you, Ralph?
Yeah, well, again, it's the company that's come up with this concept, and Minister Shane Jones has said, "Oh, this could be a good idea," so he's got involved there a bit. To what degree, I don't know. But basically, it's saying, well, we've got all these resources, all these facilities, how can we best utilise them? And so extra storage is one. They've talked about producing green hydrogen, which is different. Hydrogen that comes from methane, from natural gas, releases emissions into the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide is part of producing the hydrogen. Whereas green hydrogen, if you've got renewable electricity to electrolyse the water and produce the hydrogen, then there's no carbon emissions coming from that. There's a possibility of doing that. Hydrogen as a fuel is debatable in many ways at the moment, whether it be for cars or trucks or planes. Technically possible, but is it energy efficient to use all that electricity to produce hydrogen, store the hydrogen, turn the hydrogen back into electricity, or maybe use electricity directly? For a car, obviously, it makes more sense than for an aeroplane. But green hydrogen is a possible product that they could use. They could also produce biofuels. They're liquid fuels that could replace petrol and diesel. The IATA, the International Air Transport Association of all airlines, Air New Zealand being a strong member, has for some years looked at sustainable aviation fuels. And they've been analysing this to a great degree. United Arab Emirates, I've been involved with a little bit, and they've been very strongly supporting this and advocating for the concept, even though they produce oil themselves. The IATA have got 9 different technologies that they've approved in order to make these jet fuel. And one of them is through using green hydrogen. Another one, which Channel Infrastructure is now looking at in association with Air New Zealand and Scion, which was Forest Research Institute, is to convert woody biomass waste from the forest. So you take out the logs and then you're left with all the slash, which is quite controversial at the moment. And in Sweden and Austria and whatever, and I've been advocating here for many years too, we should be using that to chip it up and turn it into heat and power. We can turn it into electricity, and it's very viable, and it makes good sense, and it's low carbon. But
is it expensive though, Ralph? Is that where the special economic zone can come in? We can get some overseas investors in to invest in things like that.
That's exactly right. I mean, it's been done for heat and power for decades in many countries, so it's not expensive if you've got the system in place. It can be competitive. But if you've got going to sustainable aviation fuels, it's a bigger process. It's a refining process, if you like, of the woody biomass into liquid biofuels. And that's where the economic zone could attract these investors for sure, which, of course, is what government's got in mind as being a good incentive to do so. And so the process there, or nzherald is a company which is involved, which was originated in New Zealand some 20 years or more ago from a PhD study, which was looking at bacteria to take emissions from steel mills and turn them into ethanol, which is a liquid fuel. You can run petrol cars on ethanol. And that developed into a company, and then that went international. They've still got a research office in Auckland. It was New Zealand innovation at its best. And they are now looking at jet fuels as a subsidiary company of nzherald, and Scion's been looking at producing ethanol from woody biomass for decades. And it's not easy. I mean, when I was producing biodiesel in the 1970s, Forest Research Institute was looking at ethanol from wood chips. And after 20 or 30 years, they sort of gave up. So it is a challenge, but there's more development going on now. So this is where this consortium is thinking that ideally Marsden Point could be a world-leading centre for producing sustainable aviation fuels. What the volume is that they can produce is probably enough for New Zealand, but on a global capacity, it's a real challenge to substitute avgas, aviation fuel, for sustainable aviation fuels. But it's technically possible to do. And even you can turn municipal solid waste, instead of going into a landfill, you can turn that into sustainable fuels as well. So there's great hope, great potential there, but there is a challenge, A, on the chemistry, B, on the costs, C, on having a regular supply. Where would all the wood chips come from? How do they get to the refinery? Coastal shipping might be the answer to that, and rail as well, but they've got to be delivered there in large volumes. But it's certainly worth looking at.
Thanks for joining us, Ralph. The privately owned Marsden Point was New Zealand's only fuel refinery until it was decommissioned in 2022 to become an import-only fuel terminal under the name Channel Infrastructure. CEO Rob Buchanan is with us now to take us through what the future holds. Rob, how much fuel flows through Marsden Point at the moment, and where does it all go?
Yeah, so there's around 3 billion or over 3 billion litres a year of fuel that goes through the Marsden Point import terminal system. And just to give you a thumbnail sketch of how that works, our customers berth ships at Marsden Point, where their product is stored, either petrol, diesel and jet, in a significant number of tanks that we've got, in fact 300 million litres of storage on site. Most of the product is shipped down the pipeline to Auckland, where it is then distributed either to the Auckland and Waikato region, or in the case of jet, direct to Auckland Airport. And a small amount is taken off at our site to a truck loading facility for distribution into Northland.
How might Marsden Point adapt towards, I suppose, renewable energy or sustainability in the future?
Yeah, great question. So there's a couple of things there. I think the first for us is, we think that the future for decarbonisation of aviation is sustainable aviation fuel, which is drop-in, which is to say that it can flow through our infrastructure today. So as that industry transitions from fossil jet to sustainable aviation fuel over the next 20, 30 years, that product can come straight through the Marsden Point import terminal system like it can today. And one of the unique features of our location at Marsden Point, and actually it's a function of our history, is we've got a very large land holding, which is consented for at least the next 35 years anyway, for fuels manufacture. And so one of the significant opportunities that we're exploring is renewable fuels manufacture on our site as well.
And all the infrastructure's there for that, or do you need significant investment from government or, say, elsewhere under a special economic zone, say?
Well, to be clear, we're not looking for investment from government, so just to put that one to bed. But otherwise, the answer is yes to both. Yes, there is a significant amount of infrastructure there by virtue of a range of decommissioned refinery assets and refined product tanks, which are available for fuel storage, and then the pipeline, which can ship that product to Auckland, or indeed the jetty, where it can be put into a boat and distributed elsewhere. But also there is a significant amount of investment that would be required by our partners ultimately to bring renewable fuels manufacture to Marsden Point. So one of the projects that we're working on with a consortium of international investors is indeed repurposing some of the old refinery assets for biofuels production in New Zealand.
What's the goal with that? So when we talk about biofuels, what would that then be used for?
Yeah, so in relation to that particular project in particular, the main areas of focus are renewable diesel, or an alternative to diesel, and obviously sustainable aviation fuel. And just to speak to both of those, clearly there is a pathway for decarbonisation of light transport and EVs, and adoption will go up and down over time, but ultimately that pathway is there. I think that the pathway for heavy transport, and if you think about tractors on farms, getting milk from remote locations in New Zealand to manufacturing sites, getting our products to export markets and getting them in a boat and shipping them overseas, that's where renewable diesel is an opportunity to decarbonise that particular part of the supply chain. The opportunity in aviation, as I spoke to before, is sustainable aviation fuel.
In terms of sustainable aviation fuel, though, does the whole world have to get on board for it to work?
Well, that's actually a great question. And so, the most important point about sustainable aviation fuel is that it's drop-in. So where it wouldn't work is if we couldn't use that fuel in existing jet turbine technology today. So, the most important thing is that it's drop-in. You can blend it with jet today and it can go straight into the aircraft that Air New Zealand, for example, is flying around New Zealand or overseas. And so that means that we don't have to wait for technology changes at the aircraft level, which I think, let's face it, would take decades. We can actually get into this piece of work now, and various countries are taking different or are making that adoption at different speeds. Certainly, Europe is going faster than many other places. But actually, some of our major trading partners in Asia have sustainable aviation fuel targets as well, like Japan and Singapore.
Why isn't it happening, tomorrow then? Or does it cost a lot of money? I know that the recommissioning project was costed out at about $4.9 billion to $7.3 billion. That was if we made Marsden Point an oil refinery again, say. Obviously, that's a pipe dream, and that's probably... Are you confident to say that that's actually never going to happen?
Yeah, well, I think, the government did a significant piece of work on the recommissioning of the refinery and found that it was infeasible ultimately. So, it was permanently decommissioned, and our position hasn't changed on that. I think on the sustainable aviation fuel piece, I'd probably distinguish between the opportunity to manufacture it in New Zealand at Marsden Point, which we think is a fantastic opportunity, and the fact that it can actually be brought into New Zealand by a boat today and distributed through our supply chain. But you've landed on one of the key issues for adoption. There's nothing cheap about decarbonisation. We've seen it in the electricity sector, in that transition to renewable electricity and the impact that that's had on electricity prices. And it's the same with sustainable aviation fuel. It's as that technology gains traction and increasing scale is built around the world in the manufacture of sustainable aviation fuel, then the cost can come down. But right now, it's significantly more expensive than fossil jet today. So, the impact is ultimately borne by airlines or customers for making that choice around substitution between fossil jet and sustainable aviation fuel.
We are investigating the re-establishment of Marsden Point refinery. Sadly, we are left to gather the results of an awful decision made over the last 2 years, and it's driven, sir, by a mixture of wokeism, a mixture of naivety, and an unwillingness to accept without gas, without fuel, the nation will collapse. With New Zealand first in charge of such an initiative, our resilience will prosper.
What's the future look like for Marsden Point? Say in the next 10 years and then 20 years and so forth.
Yeah, well, we put out, I think, as you know, the Marsden Point Energy Precinct, which is our vision for the future of that site. And I'd summarise to you it in a couple of ways. We see it as over the next 10 to 15 years as a massive opportunity for energy security for New Zealand. And by that I mean we've got the ability to store more fuel, we've got the ability to manufacture biofuels at Marsden Point, noting that the feedstock for biofuels is domestic, so we aren't subject to the geopolitical risks that come with international shipping. And we are also working on some energy firming opportunities as well, like electricity peaking and the like. And so we think it's a real opportunity for an energy security play for New Zealand in a world which is quickly becoming more geopolitically contested. And we think it's a massive opportunity for Northland. If the energy precinct is built out as to how we think it could be over the next 10, 15, 20 years, it's 20,000 construction jobs. It's 1,200 jobs on an ongoing basis. It's $250 million contribution to New Zealand GDP. It's a massive opportunity for New Zealand Inc. And if you think about some of the deindustrialisation that we're seeing around us with manufacturing closing, high energy prices, we've got the opportunity to lean into solving a couple of those things with the energy precinct.
And in order for all of those things to happen seamlessly, do we need a special economic zone?
Well, I think the SEZ, which the Associate Minister for Energy announced back in February as something that government was considering, is, I think, something that would speed up the development of the energy precinct. So when we talk to international investors and international capital providers, they've got the choice to put their capital and their IP in many locations around the world. We think Marsden Point's a particularly unique location, but that special economic zone provides that long-term government endorsement for this being a place for energy security type projects that international investors can feel comfortable and safe about deploying capital into this area and recovering that capital and returns, which are very long dated.
And is anything happening at all, or are ministers just flocking to Marsden Point to have a look around all of a sudden? You've had 3 in the last few weeks.
Look, we've got stuff happening right now. So we're in the process of building what will be, or converting an old crude tank from the refinery into what will be New Zealand's equal largest jet tank for one of our customers, Z Energy, and that tank sits next to the other largest jet tank in New Zealand. And so that's being developed at the moment. It's got a number of innovations which will help provide additional product quality, which is obviously incredibly important for a product like jet. We've actually commenced construction for a new bitumen import terminal for one of our new customers, Higgins. And so that's going to involve building a new bitumen import line onto our wharf and jetty, a storage and distribution facility, and noting the government's policy around roads of national significance and the fact that they're looking at significant investment in roading in Auckland and north of Auckland. The next nearest bitumen import terminal is in Port Tauranga. So, it'll be an incredibly important and valuable asset for the delivery of those things. So, no, absolutely, we're kind of full flight right now getting on with some of these things.
Thanks for joining us, Rob.
Thank you very much.
That's it for this episode of The Front Page. You can read more about today's stories and extensive news coverage at nzherald.co.nz. The Front Page is produced by Jane Yee and Richard Martin, who is also our editor. I'm Chelsea Daniels. Subscribe to The Front Page on iHeartRadio or wherever you get your podcasts, and tune in tomorrow for another look behind the headlines.